The Supreme Court is deliberating after hearing arguments Wednesday on a Mississippi law that prohibits abortion after 15 weeks. The case has the potential to overturn Roe v. Wade, a move that would have enormous implications for abortion access in the United States. Joining me today, and I'm very happy to have you with us, Meagan Hatcher-Mays, attorney and director of democracy policy for Indivisible. Meagan, can you help us break down what just happened?
Yeah, I can try. I mean, I think a lot of people who've been watching the Supreme Court, a lot of people who care about abortion, about reproductive freedom, predicted that today was going to be, or that the oral arguments were going to be very grim. And they were. I think the Supreme Court, unfortunately, does look very poised to strike down Roe v. Wade in one way or another. I think the question really comes down to how they're going to do it. But there does appear to be 5 votes to uphold this Mississippi law, which would put really severe restrictions on people seeking abortions in that state. And that would open the doors for other states to follow suit with similarly restrictive laws. It was really difficult to listen to for people who think that women and people who can get pregnant should have bodily autonomy. I think a lot of the justices just don't care about that. The conservative ones in particular just don't seem to think that that is as important as pregnancy, forcing a person into pregnancy.
Yeah. Yes. I found it very, very sickening to hear the conservative judges cut off the attorney for Jackson Women's Health Organization, Julie Rickleman. She was making her arguments and they didn't even let her speak the arguments aloud, perhaps knowing that media outlets were streaming, and the whole world is watching whether the United States will roll back a woman's right to choose. Is this normal, or were we just seeing partisan politics play out on the Supreme Court?
That's a great question. It's difficult to answer. It's normal for this particular constellation of justices. Yes. It's not normal for a fundamental constitutional right to be at risk in this way. Usually when something is settled in front of the Supreme Court for 50 years, that's kind of the end of the story, especially when that right is so fundamental to kind of the fabric of American life. And that's what abortion and reproductive rights are. They are really fundamental to the way that women can participate in life. That's how we know we are equal, is because we have the ability to choose for ourselves how we want to live our lives. And that's been true with the Supreme Court for 50 years. They decided Roe in 1973, and then they reaffirmed it in Casey in 1992. And here we are. The fact that the court decided to take this case at all is appalling. This is well settled constitutional precedent, a woman's right to choose. It has been for 50 years. So the fact that they're hearing this case at all is really depressing. And it's not normal for this to be the case in front of the Supreme Court.
Can you give us a little bit of a breakdown of the mechanics? It's not a complete overturn of Roe v. Wade. So could you give us a little bit of the mechanics of what's going on here legally?
Sure. Well, so Mississippi actually is asking the court to completely overturn Roe versus Wade and to overturn Casey, the two kind of leading precedents on abortion rights in this country. But barring that, what they would like the Supreme Court to do is to at least uphold this 15-week ban. And so there might be some people watching this thinking, 15 weeks, well, that's not as bad as Texas's ban, right? Because that bans them after 6. But any ban on pre-viability pregnancies is not good. And it is misogynistic. It sets women as second-class citizens anytime that the state tries to interfere with our right to choose what's best for our bodies. So Mississippi's asking for either for the court to overturn Roe versus Wade entirely, or to at the very least uphold this 15-week ban, which, despite what folks may think, is actually just as bad as an 8-week or 6-week ban on pregnancy. What that would do if the court were to uphold the 15-week ban, it would open the door for other states to say, who may be sitting on the sidelines, say, okay, great, well, we can at least do a 15-week ban. And for a fact that a lot of more conservative states are going to want to push the limits of those week-long bans.
And so the legal precedent is really viability. That's what this all turns on.
Yeah.
A woman has her own rights until the unborn or the fetus is viable outside the womb, which would bestow at this point in history some rights on that particular fetus. Am I getting that right?
That's basically right. Yeah, that's exactly right. So basically, how it works is that pre-viability, the woman has an interest in how she wants this pregnancy to proceed. At a certain point, which is post-viability, what the court has said is post-viability, there's an interest that shifts from the woman and possibly to the state, who has an interest now in making sure that a fetus that is viable can survive. So you have to weigh those interests. And historically, the court has said pre-viability, it goes in favor of the woman carrying the pregnancy, and post-viability, there might be some opportunities there for the state to get involved. So that's exactly right. That's exactly what's at stake here today. Whether states can actually move that bright line back from viability into pre-viability, which then affects women's interests in.
But what would the legal case be for that? I mean, what would it even be? I was listening to the whole court proceeding, but as a non-attorney myself, it was kind of hard to parse exactly what legal standing they would have to do this.
Yeah, I mean, the real answer to that question is that there isn't a good one. There's not a good constitutional argument, and there's not a good legal argument to deny women the right to abortion. I think Justice Kagan basically said this. Not much has changed, actually, from 1973 to today. These are still tough questions. But the court back then said, we know it's a tough question, but this is what we've decided. And we have to stick with this because there's always going to be somebody who disagrees with us. And so that's what's happening. Mississippi is like, well, I disagree with you, and I think you should overturn it. There's very specific situations in which a court can overturn their precedent. And in my view, this doesn't rise to the level of that. Basically, it's usually a situation where so much has changed in American society that justice really requires that we overturn it. And I think we have seen that in like Brown v. Board and in Plessy v. Ferguson, where we were dealing with racial discrimination and school segregation. Ultimately, the court said we can't continue to allow these laws to exist, even though previously they had said it was fine. This is a situation where nothing like that has shifted. There is no new emerging scientific information that shows that, that has fundamentally changed our understanding of how pregnancies work from 1973 to today, as far as whether or not abortions should be legal. So there's really no good basis to do this. I think even the Mississippi state legislatures who passed this bill into law admitted as much when they passed it. They said the reason that we're doing this is because the makeup of the Supreme Court is different, and we think we have a chance to get this law upheld. That's why they're doing it. It's purely political, it's purely partisan, and they're hoping that the new constellation of justices on the Supreme Court will join them in this partisan attack on women's bodily autonomy and reproductive freedom.
This goes outside of, the law, but it goes to social policy. Don't you think that if lawmakers and community members and religious leaders who really wanted to bring the numbers of abortions down could look at the statistics of why women sometimes and often have abortions? Often it is for financial reasons. They simply cannot afford to feed, clothe, educate a child in this world where social services are being cut left and right. Perhaps they already have children. Would it not be just a better way to go about bringing the numbers of abortions down if that truly is the reason for this constant push against a woman's right to choose? Wouldn't it just be easier to do that by increasing social supports for women so that they could have children that they might, otherwise feel they have to choose against?
Yes, absolutely. It's very ironic because the backdrop of this case is right now the Senate is debating whether or not to include paid leave and a universal pre-K in this big spending bill that they're trying to pass. You can't have one without the other. If you want to encourage people to have kids, if there's, then we need to be able to support the people who are getting pregnant. And actually this came up again during oral arguments. Mississippi has an extremely high mortality rate for women who give birth in that state. It's very, very high. So at the very least, we need to be examining, regardless of what happens with this case, we need to be examining how do we protect women who are giving birth from death? How do we protect those kids once they're born? So making sure that they have access to good education, universal pre-K, making sure that their parents have access to economic opportunities so that having a child is not such a sort of grave expense. But of course, the same people who are arguing to overturn abortion laws also don't support expanding the social safety net. So we're really in a grim era right now.
It's hard not to make the argument that this is really just about subjugating women, because
Correct.
most women, if they have a child, aren't just going to throw that child on the open sea and say, sorry, I can't feed you. You know, you can't leave kids in the woods. You know what I mean?
Yes, right.
And most women would not do that anyway. And so that means women's choices are going to be curtailed. If they don't have childcare, how are they going to have a job? How are they going to participate in the economy?
That's exactly right. And I think people, to that point, people should understand that this is not going to stop at abortion, because up next is access to contraception. Up next is, who knows what.
I heard them talking. So, thank you for bringing that up. I heard them talking about that. I forget which one of these right-wing nuts were like, well, abortions cost $600 at the Jackson clinic. And you also have to have, get a ride fees and other fees, but contraception costs much less. Well, contraception, number one, is fallible. Therefore, they're just blaming the woman for getting pregnant. They just clearly, plus women are going to just drive if they have the means to other states. So that price argument is not.
Right. People, and this has always been true, high income women are always going to be able to get safe and legal abortions. That's not in question. This is going to disproportionately negatively impact low income women, Black women, and women of color. Already does. These mortality rates that I was talking about before, that very disproportionately affects Black women and women of color in Mississippi. So high income women are going to be fine no matter what. White women, high income women are going to be okay. But this is really about really, just like what you said, subjugating women to carry pregnancies to term that they don't want or can't afford, because they also aren't able to access contraception either. That's also true. So this is really very grim, very scary time for women in this country, because it's, again, not going to stop at Texas and Mississippi.
So the case does not just outright and ban abortions, right? But there is this. So I'm glad you could give us the breakdown of what's happening there. When the court comes back into session on Monday, what do you expect to see and hear?
Yeah, first of all, I think that this case probably will not be decided anytime soon. So the arguments were today, but usually these cases that are very fraught with sort of social issues, for lack of a better word, those take a long time to decide. So usually those big ticket cases don't get decided until the end of term. So that would be June 2022. That's historically been the case for like the gay marriage cases and other big cases like that. They just take a long time to compromise.
But arguments are done. Is that right?
Arguments are done. But we're still waiting to hear actually from the Supreme Court on what they're going to do about Texas's abortion ban. So that would be SB 8. The Supreme Court has taken no action on that bill yet, which has allowed, that very draconian law out of Texas to be in place for 93 days, I think, at this point.
That's the 6-week ban. Plus you can report on your neighbors and anyone who participates in any way, be it giving you an aspirin, giving you a Uber ride in an abortion, can be penalized.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It basically created a bounty system for private citizens to sue their neighbors, and they can get a $10,000 bonus if they succeed. It's horrific. So it could be that we hear next week finally what the Supreme Court wants to do about that case. Well, they had gotten the case over the summer, and then they heard arguments about this already.
Right.
And then they heard arguments in the Mississippi case this week. So it's been kind of like a month-long journey for reproductive justice at the Supreme Court. I think honestly, I think this is a break glass moment for reproductive justice in this country. I think people should be really concerned about what's going to happen in the Supreme Court. I think even if the Supreme Court allows this challenge over SB 8 to continue, I don't think that Roe v. Wade, as we know it, stands much of a chance because of this sort of assault on the judiciary from the right for the last 50 years. That this is the culmination of that. They've stacked the Supreme Court with extremists, and the whole point was to get people on the bench to overturn Roe v. Wade, and we're here now. It's happening. It's very concerning. It's very scary.
It's very hard to look over, we can look to history, but it is very hard to look at contemporary civic life in the United States and even picture what it means to not have safe abortion available to women.
Yeah, I shudder to even try to imagine that future. I think everybody in the progressive atmosphere really needs to start thinking about how we're going to get women the care that they need if they live in states that have made it so difficult to get just basic healthcare services. So that's going to have to be an ongoing conversation, because this really is not looking good for bodily autonomy, reproductive justice, and all fundamental rights that we thought were secure in front of the Supreme Court, quite frankly, are up for grabs, I think, at this point. That's how frightening the conservative justices on the Supreme Court are.
Well, we'll have to get into a discussion with you if you could come back and talk about expanding the court.
I know of course.
Okay, I'm gonna literally email you right after this.
Great.
And we'll get you back
all I
on
want to
that.
do is add those seats.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much, Meagan Hatcher-Mays, Director of Democracy Policy for Indivisible. I really appreciate you being here with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay. Well, that was great. It's very depressingly horrid, but good interview.
Something nice to say, but I was like, we're fucked.
I know. I heard that in the voice. I'm like, we're totally fucked. And then the other, like, I'm not exactly sure, like, which one would be worse, the Mississippi one or the Texas one, or are they going to do both? I mean,
yeah. I actually think what's probably going to happen is that they're going to try to sell it as a compromise, right? So that they'll take some action that looks good on SB 8, where it's like, okay, well, that goes too far. And then by comparison, it's the Mississippi law is going to not look as bad, right? Because it's like, oh, 8 weeks is bad, but 15 weeks, that seems reasonable. But it's not. I mean, but I think that's what they're going to try to do as like a PR move, is to try to convince people that it is not that bad. But
if they're working on a PR move, that means they're not, a Supreme Court that is above partisan politics. They're working specifically for what I would call the fascist movement in the United States.
Yeah, and John Roberts in particular is hyper aware of public perception of the court. And so he tends to be an incrementalist who makes PR moves that make it look like what he's doing isn't that bad. Unfortunately, what's happened is that a bunch of the other conservatives who've since been confirmed are accelerationists who don't care as much about that. Mm-hmm. And so they might care a little bit about the perception of the court. We actually saw over the summer, like a bunch of them were giving, I've never seen this before, giving remarks basically saying like, oh, we don't need to add seats. The Supreme Court's perfect. We're not politicians. We're not partisans, blah, blah, blah. But they wouldn't be saying that unless they were scared that like, that we were going to do it, that we were going to add the seats, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't really know what to make of all of that, but they are aware of public perception. So they want to do the bad thing. They just don't want anyone to notice that they've done the bad thing. If that makes sense. So
obviously this is going to go into the interview.
Sorry, it was very casual.
Do you have any thoughts about whether Biden and his administration would even consider this? And if I'm thinking politically, I'm thinking, well, if I'm Biden and I'm thinking politically, and I might actually consider doing this, or the Democrats in general, I would want to wait until the Supreme Court showed its ultra conservative hand for all to see, because again, I believe it's 72% of Americans, which is an enormous majority, want abortion to be safe and legal. This is a small minority of people who are pushing for this, conservative, ultra conservative agenda. Do you think the Biden administration or the Democrats would actually take that kind of action?
That's a great question. So I think that Supreme Court expansion, so look, it's not that popular. I think people think that that's like a nuclear option to add seats to the Supreme Court. I think what advocates for court expansion, myself included, would say is that's right. It is the nuclear option because the Republicans have already declared nuclear war on the Supreme Court. And today was the culmination of that of that battle, right? This is exactly what they've been working for since 1973. So I think it's an uphill climb. It's going to be a long battle because nothing that progressives ever do starts out particularly popular, and that's okay. But, I think that whether it must be done is a different question of whether or not Democrats have the spine to actually do it. But to your point, it absolutely is going to take some big thing to get people to pay attention to the Supreme Court, people on the left in particular, to pay attention to the Supreme Court and realize that there actually is a solution to this problem. Congress can add seats to the Supreme Court. You don't need a constitutional amendment to make this happen. What I think is already starting to happen, which is good, is that there have already been a lot of high-profile examples of the Supreme Court, overreaching, right? So they've now gutted the Voting Rights Act twice. They allowed SB 8 to go into effect over the summer. They are forcing the Biden administration to continue with Trump's racist Remain in Mexico immigration policy. All of these things stick in the public's mind as bad. And in fact, the Supreme Court's approval ratings are the lowest they have ever been. So when people don't like something, they typically want to change it. So it's going to take some work to get people to understand like how important Supreme Court expansion is to like a healthy democracy. It's going to take a lot of work to get Senate Democrats and Joe Biden to support that as well. But if they, and I think that they're going to, effectively overturn Roe v. Wade next June, there really is no other option. This is not now an institution that you can rehabilitate. That would be so far off the rails of mainstream legal thought, and not just about abortion, but about how the Supreme Court decides cases and then maintains that precedent over the course of years. There is no way to fix that other than to add the seats. And so if Joe Biden's not there yet, he needs to get there.
Well, perhaps instead of clutching our pearls when they denied Merrick Garland to Obama, we should have had a more forthright, at least they showed their hand on what they were willing to do.
Oh, yeah. The whole ball game is the federal courts, and it always has been. I mean, actually, Donald Trump didn't get much done while he was president, but what he did do
Thank God.
was, I know, yes, that's correct. But what he did do was big time tax cuts for rich people, and he overtook the federal judiciary. That's pretty big. Whenever Mitch McConnell is looking at something, we need to look there too. And he spent the 4 years that Donald Trump was president staring down the federal courts. Donald Trump is responsible for confirming almost a third of the overall federal judiciary. So Trump is not president anymore. He is gone. But the people that he picked to sit on the federal courts will be there for life, for the rest of their lives. And a lot of them are really young, like 36, 37 years old. So Trumpism persists in the federal judiciary, even though Donald Trump himself is not currently president. This is very scary. People need to understand that the courts themselves are hostile to democratic interests because of who is picking these judges. So even if we get stuff passed through Congress, which I think is critically important, it's actually not the end game. The end game is to fix the courts too. Otherwise, we won't be able to keep any of the stuff that we actually get passed. That includes voting rights, that includes democracy reform. If the Women's Health Protection Act, which would set, federal right to abortion, all of that stuff is at risk unless we fix the courts as well. So Senate Democrats might not be there yet. Joe Biden might not be there yet, but they need to get there because the Supreme Court is helping sort of the Trumpist forces move forward, even though Trump is not currently the president.
Meagan Hatcher-Mays, attorney and director of democracy policy for Indivisible. The interview is over now.
Okay.
Thank you so much for being here with me.
Problem.
I really appreciate it. And I'm sure our viewers appreciate you breaking down what seems to be an ominous and potentially depressing day in the history of women's rights.
I wish I had better news for everyone, but there's still fight left, I think, out there. So, and as you can see, I literally could talk about the courts for hours. So if you ever want to talk,
good. I am literally calling you back immediately. We've been covering voting rights for the whole time here. So I definitely would love to get your take on as that moves forward. Okay, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Have a good one.